During the Great War on the front between France and Germany, most of the fighting was done in France. The area which the Germans occupied only amounted to 7% of the landmass of France. However, as a result of German occupation, French coal production fell 37% and steel production fell 60%. I thought of a way to approximate the cost of having the war fought on France would be to compare the economic contractions of Germany versus the economic contractions of France during the Great War. Between 1914 and 1918, German GDP in US dollars fell from $202.206 billion to $194.612 billion, a contraction of $7.594 billion. France's economy, on the other hand, fell from $134.23 billion in 1914 to $92.328 billion in 1918, for a loss of $41.902 billion in GDP. Remember, this is not just a one-year loss, this is a collapse in annual output over those years. France's economic contraction was $34.308 billion greater than the contraction of Germany, and the French economy was only two-thirds the size of the German economy at the start of the war. The Versailles Treaty demanded Germany pay France 132 billion gold marks, the equivalent of 33 billion US dollars. In my opinion, the true cost of the fighting in France was probably around $90 billion. And so if that cost was to be assigned to Germany, then Versailles was actually lenient by this standard. I'm not sure France was owed that, given her alliance with Russia and pledge to defend Serbia. The fact that Germany technically declared war on France, I think, is kind of a baby talk argument. France was allied with Russia, and Germany had no obligation to throw away its advantage of faster mobilization by waiting for France to formalize the obvious, the fact that France was at war with Germany, with the trivia of a declaration. The war was going to be fought somewhere, and the fact that the Germans managed to have it fought in France is just them having been better prepared. Of course, the reparations to Belgium were perhaps more difficult to argue against. And on that, you could say that Germany only managed to keep the fighting in France for the whole of the war because they invaded Belgium. But Germany's invasion of Belgium came at the cost of dragging Britain into the war, perhaps a year earlier than they otherwise would have. Germany paid the price for invading Belgium by having British forces, and more importantly, the British blockade, being in force around a year earlier, I would estimate, as a result of their having invaded Belgium. And the Germans decided this was worth it. And it's possible that even with the Schlieffen Plan failed and dragging the British into the war earlier and dragging a non-trivial Belgian army into the war, all of these things may have still been worth it for Germany as it kept the war against France in France. So back to reparations. I'm not making some moral claim that Germany actually owed this to France. I'm simply saying that what was being assigned to Germany to pay France was, if anything, an underestimate of the true cost of the war being in France itself. But even this sum, Germany refused to pay. And so in 1923, French troops moved into the Rhineland to try to force Germany to pay. This operation, which lasted from January 11th, 1923 to August 25th, 1925, the French occupation of the Rhine, was successful in extracting about $225 million from the Germans in the form of gold marks. It's been speculated that this just about covered the cost of the occupation itself, though that's hard to quantify. All in all, by 1932, when reparations were canceled, Germany paid France about $5 billion. And considering some proportion of that went to Belgium, I don't know how much of that $5 billion even went to France. The Germans had been given several gifts at Versailles. First, they were given the gift of removing their armed forces, reduced to 100,000 men, and similarly blessed reductions in their navy. They had the tumors, known as the colonies, removed, which cost more to administer than they ever brought in revenue, and Britain and France, the supposed victors, were then saddled with these tumors. With the army mostly destroyed and then reformed as a technically new organization, the Reichswehr, much of the old guard was gone. Only a few men could be in this new army, so it was going to be young guys, and of course only the best. And of course this army realistically didn't have any obligations. It would not be able to repel an invasion against Belgium, for example, if Belgium decided to invade Germany at this time. So what do you have? you had an army, quote unquote, with no pressing commitments, made up of not only young men, but the best young men who had distinguished themselves in combat or were at the top of their classes in the military schools. And the Reichswehr was all officers in practice. Even in theory, according to the treaty, you had to have a certain number of them technically hold the rank of private. In reality, once the army expanded, all these quote-unquote privates in the Reichswehr would all be rapidly promoted to officer positions in a new army. So what happened in this environment? Well, they came up with the reforms of 1923. They threw themselves into theory, into a new doctrine. And this doctrine was given a name by the English, which they called Lightning War. But since it was German, they used the terms Blitzkrieg. In addition, Germany didn't have the strain of maintaining a large standing army. From 1926 to 1935, French military spending was $4.116 billion equivalent, and that's the sum over all of those 10 years. The German military spending was $1.692 billion. During this time, the German economy averaged about 136.6% the size of the French economy. So the Treaty of Versailles saved Germany $2.424 billion from what they would have had to spend to match French military spending, or $3.930 billion from what they would have had to spend to match French spending in terms of proportion of GDP. If Germany, for example, wanted a military superior to the French military in line with the superiority of their economy. And this doesn't include military spending that France did and Germany didn't do between the years 1919 and 1925, which I couldn't find data on. And so if we consider, that would have probably been another $1 billion in savings for Germany in the Germany matches France scenario, or another $1.5 billion in the Germany matches France's proportionate economic spending scenario, then given how fuzzy all of this is, it looks like Germany, not having had to spend much on their military, roughly offset what they paid in reparations to France and Belgium. And without the Treaty of Versailles, there's certainly no way any regime in Germany could survive a reduction of the military that much. The only way Germany could have had this kind of military reduction would be if it was forced upon them on an outside power. And being denied a significant navy, Germany couldn't invest in all these large capital ships in the 1920s that would end up being not particularly useful in a general war 10 years later. Of course, Germany made a few, but as the war went on, the German lack of a competitive surface fleet with the British led to their focus on submarines, which could be built much more quickly and were on the order of 20 times more cost effective in terms of destroying merchant shipping. Being denied the ability to build a navy that could possibly be a surface fleet competitor to Britain ultimately diverted German resources into submarines as the war went on. And as a result, the German Navy was more effective in World War II than it was in World War I, simply because the naval limitations of the Versailles Treaty forced the Germans to invest more in the much more effective submarine strategy. And being denied an air force, Germany wasn't saddled with an old guard in their air force with World War I era ideas, nor were they saddled with a bunch of old inventory that had to be rotated every year at great expense. And so the defeat gave Germany the gift of clearing out all of this old detritus, all of this old thinking in the army, in the navy, and in the air force, allowed them to spend over a decade to focus on theory and tactics and doctrine. So by the time that the war actually broke out, since it was at Germany's choosing when the war broke out, all aspects of the armed forces would be on the bleeding edge in terms of doctrine, and to a lesser extent on the bleeding edge in terms of equipment. France, on the other hand, having won the war, had no impetus to change its doctrine. The old army was kept in place, with as many of the old generals kept in place as they could. But one thing to consider is that in, say, 1938, just 1 year before the war started, what evidence was there that, for example, tanks would be decisive, or that spearhead breakthroughs? This kind of hard-charging battle doctrine, lightning warfare, was pioneered by the Prussians, and then made even better by the French under Napoleon, and then arguably perfected again by the Prussians in the 1860s and 1870s. All of this was found to not work at all during the Great War. And this is because there was simply too much firepower on the battlefield. And the kind of hard-charging breakthrough tactics simply resulted in men going over the top and getting killed en masse. Modern warfare then was methodical, rolling barrages, carefully planned attacks with heavy support, and mapping out the trenches, choreographed moves, everything done methodically. Methodical battle, pioneered by Pathe, then copied by the Germans in 1918 with the stormtrooper offensives. So here you have these young generals saying that the war of the future is actually the war of the past. Hard charging was going to make a comeback. That tanks and trucks and air power would move troops faster than ever. Well, they had trucks in the Great War. Certainly they're a lot better by 1940, but are they so much better as to radically alter the doctrine? They had tanks in the Great War too, and they did not change the nature of the battle back then. In fact, the tanks back then were used with some success precisely in the context of methodical battle. This idea of tanks leading a hard charging breakthrough at some point on the battle line, that was not tried or tested, really, until Poland. On the flip side, what made war in 1914 so much more static than it had been in 1871? Firepower. And were the artillery and machine guns going to be more or less effective in 1940 than they were in 1914? Obviously, they were only going to get better. And given that artillery and machine guns had improved since 1914, we might expect warfare to be even more static than it was during the Great War. Air power. Some thought air power would break the stalemate and make war more mobile. Really? In the Great War, air power prevented mobility because it revealed troop positions, thus making it more difficult for an attacker to surprise the defender by shifting troops around to get a localized overmatch needed for a breakthrough. Air power made it much harder for either side to get the element of surprise needed to carry off a successful attack. In addition, infantry assaults, men charging out into the open, could be strafed by airplanes, forcing them into trenches for safety, thus further reducing the mobility of the battle. Okay, what about wars since the Great War? Well, there was the Russian Civil War, including the Polish-Soviet War, which I would consider part of the Russian Civil War. But that was such a complete dog's breakfast that not much of anything could really be learned from any of the battles that occurred in the Russian Civil War. And the Spanish Civil War, from 1936 to 1938, was certainly more fluid than the Western Front of the Great War, but even so, mass tank columns making great breakthroughs and encirclement battles, as the Lightning War theorist Little Hart predicted, simply did not happen in Spain. Sure, the war was more mobile than the Western Front of the Great War was, but you would expect that given that the surface area of the combat zone was about 10 times the size, with about 1/5 the troops. It would be shocking if the war in Spain wasn't significantly more mobile than the Western Front of the Great War. And air power could situationally affect the outcome of battles here and there in Spain, but this was true during the Great War as well. And France, of course, was developing an air force that was intended to be a near peer of Germany's. And it wasn't until 1937 and 1938 that the Germans started to pull ahead of France in terms of the effectiveness of their air force. And France simply couldn't scramble in time to develop new fighter designs and expand production fast enough in an attempt to try to keep up with the expansion of the German Air Force, which had the advantage of momentum. But surely the war with Poland was the vivid proof that Little Hart and the Lightning War theorists were right all along. Well, you could say that. Here's another interpretation. Poland deployed too far forward. They had too much cavalry, and they tried to be too mobile against the Germans. In fact, Polish resistance was most effective as the Germans entered into the region around Lodz, Kutno, Modlin, and Warsaw, as the Poles were forced into a ball and fell back behind fortifications and fieldwork lines. And more ominous, the fortress at Modlin, which was built in 1812, held out against the Germans for 16 days. And the battles around the fortified Ball in central Poland went much better, or I should say less badly for the Poles, than the mobile battles at the frontier did. So what lessons are to be drawn from Poland? Well, here's a lesson. A fort built 128 years ago was still somewhat effective in holding up attacks against Panzer IIIs and Stukas. How's that for a lesson to draw? But there was another war that occurred just a few months later in Finland, the war between the Soviet Union and Finland. And in this, Finland, relying mainly on static defenses at the Mannerheim line and whatever defenses they could manage along the gargantuan northern border, they achieved a kill-death ratio against the attacking Soviets of 5-1. And they did this even though the Soviets outnumbered the Finns roughly 2-1 in manpower, about 200-1 in tanks, and 34-1 in aircraft. The Winter War seemed to vindicate the effectiveness of fixed defenses being super effective and aircraft and tanks being more bark than bite, just like they were in Spain, just like they were in World War I. Not to say that tanks and airplanes are worthless, but just that they are situational and are just one piece of a whole methodical battle. So have I made a compelling case here? Of course, you and I know what happened. We know that the French got it wrong and the Germans got it right, and any of the French generals looking back in hindsight would agree. I'm not saying that these are the correct conclusions to draw. I'm simply saying, can't you see how someone could draw these conclusions? The increase in firepower is what made warfare more static in the Great War than previously. Why would we expect this trend to go in the other direction as we go to 1940, to where firepower actually enhances mobility? Tanks didn't do much to enhance mobility in World War I, or in Spain, or in Finland. Maybe you could make a case that tanks punched through in Poland and had those great encirclement battles that Little Hart talked about, but the Poles did better when they curled up into static defensive positions. And in Finland, the tanks completely sputtered. Aircraft during the Great War made battle more static, not less, and certainly didn't make the war in Finland more mobile. It didn't appear to make the war in Spain more mobile, and in Poland, it's hard to tell. Given what the French generals had seen up to that point, it's not stupid to think that methodical battle as a general philosophy would win out. Just have a little perspective before one dons the uniform of hindsight general. Ah, the Maginot Line, the great failure of French military planning. The Germans just went around it. Here's something to consider. France in 1939 had a population of 42 million, while Germany and Austria had a population of 76 million. For France to field an army the same size as Germany's, which they did, roughly, they would have to be calling up a larger percentage of their population. This means calling up old farts. So how do you use the old guys, aged 40 to 50, on the battlefield? Well, you put them in fixed defensive positions. So given the kind of manpower France would have to dig into, they had to realistically consider what these men could actually do. And so they put them in forts. Their lack of fitness didn't really matter if they're just in a bunker. You could say, but wait a minute, Britain had a population of 47.5 million. And so combined, their population was 10 million larger than that of Germany's. So if Britain made just as much of a manpower commitment as France did to the war, then doesn't this problem go away? And that's very funny, right? Nobody thought that Britain would pull their weight in terms of manpower to be committed to a land battle. Everyone knew Britain was not going to do that. That is the way of the eternal Anglo. Perfidious Albion was not going to make the same level of sacrifice that France was going to. That's just the reality. And something else to consider beyond the manpower issue is that the Maginot Line was built from 1929 to 1935 for the Maginot Line proper, and there are several extensions that were built up to 1938. So say you think the French should have invested more in aircraft in their air force. Well, first off, remember that the Maginot Line only cost about $118 million, or about 3 billion francs, less than half the military budget for France for a single year. The Maginot Line was very cheap for what it did. It was fortifications and casemates built in depth with interval troops to prevent sappers from just getting up and around the bunkers and turrets and blowing them up. The idea of the Maginot Line wasn't that it would stop an invasion cold, but that it would hold up an invasion long enough for the main army to move in and plug the gap. This is because of the defender's and attacker's advantage. The defender's advantage is that he's in defense. He can sit back and shoot from protected positions, while you have to attack over an open area, being more visible and more vulnerable. The attacker's advantage is that he masses his troops at one location and outnumbers you at that location. In a successful attack, the purpose isn't to achieve a good kill-death ratio in the process of breaking through a line. Even when the attacker successfully breaks through, he usually loses more men than the enemy in the process of the breakthrough. Not always, but you don't attack fixed defenses for the purpose of an attritional advantage. It's what comes after the breakthrough. You get this big army in the backfield, destroying the logistics, destroying the artillery, hitting units from behind. That's the payoff from a breakthrough. And the French knew this and even achieved it from time to time in the Great War. The French public were propagandized that the Maginot Line was the shield of France, but the French High Command knew what it was. They didn't think it was impenetrable, and they didn't act as if it was impenetrable. They kept 4 armies down there to reinforce any potential breakthrough of the Maginot Line. But what if the Germans go around the Maginot Line? Well, the French were very well aware that the Germans could do so, and in fact, their main plan to deal with the Germans was counting on the Germans not attacking the Maginot Line. The French general strategy was based on the assumption that the Germans would attack through Belgium north of the Ardennes. French and British troops would move up to the KW line, while the Belgians fought a delaying action on the Albert Canal as long as possible. Then the Belgians would retreat to the KW line and would fight the Germans from there opportunistically, along with the British and French. Maurice Gamelin also had a plan to move the line up to Breda in Holland if Germany invaded Holland. General Alphonse Gerges and Maxime Weygand argued against this, that this stretched too far and exposed the French to an attack from the south. Gamelin's reason for moving into Breda if Holland was invaded was because Holland had a mobilization schedule of about 300,000 men. This is, in my estimation, the real reason for the Breda variant. Gamelin wanted those Dutch divisions to be pulled down into the KW line. Though he expected the Dutch to try to defend their country, as is natural, hopefully they would see the writing on the wall sooner rather than later and send their troops down through the Breda Gap toward the KW line, where they could actually be useful, not isolated in the hopeless cause of defending Holland and destroyed in detail up there, which is exactly what Gamelin predicted would happen if the Dutch chose to fight up in Holland for too long, which is exactly what did happen. The Dutch did not choose to send their army down into Belgium. They chose to try to defend their own country instead and were completely annihilated as a result. Now, a quick aside here, why didn't the French extend the Maginot Line all the way to the Channel? And once you know about the deal plan and the KW line, it should immediately make sense. The French planned to fight in Belgium. That's why they didn't extend the Maginot Line. One of the reasons as well was cost, but the Maginot Line is cheap. Forts are dirt cheap, so that's not really the deciding factor. At least I don't think that was. The main reason was that the French needed to work with Belgium. And if France had a fortified line along the Belgian border, that would tell the Belgians that the French had plans for the event of a Belgian collapse. The Belgians may then presume France planned to abandon them, or at least that the French weren't totally committed to saving Belgium. And this may result in the Belgians not fighting particularly hard against the Germans, because Belgian resistance against the Germans only made sense in the context of France coming in, as Belgium fighting alone would be completely futile. And regarding the cost of a Maginot Line extension, given that the Western Allies planned for this war to take place in Belgium, having fortifications so far back may not see any use and end up being a worthless investment. Whereas the fortifications along the French-German border, even if they never saw any use directly in terms of actual combat, by channeling the German invasion into Belgium, they were ultimately useful. In 1938, the French had wargamed an offensive through the Ardennes, and they found that they could get through it in about 3 days with a significant army with tanks. In response to this wargame, the French actually increased the number of divisions facing the Ardennes and increased the fortifications around Sedan and along the Meuse River facing Belgium. And they also advised the Belgians to increase their allotment to the Ardennes area. The French were very well aware of the potential to strike through the Ardennes. They did not think it was impenetrable. Pétain said the Ardennes would be impenetrable with certain provisions, and the French were very well aware of the potential of the Germans going through the Ardennes as a way to bypass the KW line. The original German plans drawn up for the invasion of France were a simple repeat of World War I. Hitler didn't like any of these plans. Luckily for the Germans, 2 majors who were doing an air patrol over Belgium crash landed and had plans of their offensive seized. So now the Belgians and the French and British knew about the German plan to repeat the route they took during the Great War, which was exactly what the Deal Plan, which is the defense along the KW line, was designed to stop. Having lost their plans, the Germans knew that the operation was compromised. Hitler, in a meeting with Erich Manstein, was informed of Manstein's plan, called sickle stroke. In terms of approximate combat power in sickle stroke, 1/3 would be used in an invasion of Belgium and Holland to draw up the main French and British force as far as possible, which would be the BEF, the 2 best French armies, and the Belgian army, which came to be known as First Army Group. And so they would draw First Army Group as far north as possible, hopefully getting all the way up into Holland, as Gamelin was inclined to do anyway, in hopes of getting some Dutch troops. Then the main army, with 2/3 of the offensive power, would move through the Ardennes. The Germans predicted, and were correct in predicting, that the Allies would not appreciate the size of the German forces in the Ardennes due to the forest and general German air superiority, which would make Allied reconnaissance ineffective. Because the French and British planned to not fight in so much of Holland and Belgium, the diversionary army, we can call it, under von Bock, wouldn't be stress tested by the main Allied armies until it reached the KW line. This meant that the German diversion would be extremely effective so long as they could manhandle the Belgians and Dutch with only 1/3 of the offensive power in such a convincing way that the Allies believed that this was the main German advance. And as we know with hindsight, the Germans succeeded in this for about 5 days, which was all they needed. Relevant to the Ardennes disaster that we know is coming is the German occupation of the Rhineland in 1936. When the Germans occupied the Rhineland in 1936, there were calls in France to go in and just wreck the Germans in there and maybe finally get those reparations. In hindsight, we know that the French could have done this in 1936, that they would have had superiority in all arms, and I personally think that this would have been the end of Hitler. Because remember, in 1936, Hitler hadn't annexed Austria or Czechoslovakia or had the rapid victory in Poland. This was Hitler's first foreign adventure, in a sense, and if it ended in catastrophic defeat for the Germans and a second Rhineland occupation, I think that would have been it for Hitler. The problem is that the French believed the Germans to be far stronger than they actually were. They believed that the Germans had 1 million men total under arms and about 300,000 in the Rhineland. In reality, the Germans probably had less than 200,000 men total under arms. The French chose not to invade because they were convinced that the German army was bigger than it really was, and thus the French would have to call up reservists. And the French government at the time almost certainly would have collapsed if they instituted conscription and started a second Great War over what? Over the Germans occupying their own territory? Because the French believed defeating the Germans in the Rhineland would be much more of a commitment than it actually would have been, because they fell for German propaganda and bad intelligence as to how powerful they really were, the French ended up not going in. Okay, why does this matter? This matters because This is what convinced Leopold III of Belgium to break his alliance with France and become technically neutral. This meant that French troops couldn't move into Belgium until Belgium was actually invaded by Germany. They couldn't move in beforehand and get settled in and set up and become familiar with the Belgian terrain and defensive works and just build trenches, which is something a lot of people don't think about, but building defensive field works for their infantry. No, they had to race in at the last minute as soon as Germany arrived and would have to meet them somewhere along the KW line, which they would have to get familiar with real quick. So September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. 2 days later, France and Britain declare war on Germany. Prior to the declaration of war, Gamelin had made a verbal commitment to the Poles that should Germany attack, France would launch an attack on Germany within 15 days. France did ultimately make a few probing attacks, and then were ordered to fall back on September 21st, when it became clear to the French that Poland would likely be defeated within a month at the most. Poland surrendered 16 days later. The fact is that the French simply needed a few more weeks to get everything prepared for a big offensive. As they were making the preparations for the kinds of offensives they would launch during the Great War into Germany, Poland was collapsing before France could get all of the artillery, supply depots, and logistics lines set up to supply and man an offensive to try to break through the German fortifications. As it happened, the French accurately estimated about how many German divisions were facing them, about 20 to 25 divisions. Turns out it was 23. But the French army only had 104 divisions in May of 1940. This is September 1939. I don't know how many fully manned divisions the French had in September 1939, but it was certainly going to be less as mobilization in France had just started. And it's not simply that the French would have to win against the 25 at most German units facing them. Certainly France could deal with 25 German divisions. It's that they had to attack the Siegfried Line and do it fast enough to aid Poland. Keep in mind that in 1944-1945, the Western Allies stopped their advance at the Siegfried Line to set up an attack. The French were in a similar boat. By the time the French were getting assembled enough for anything like an assault on the line, the situation in Poland was already settled. The French did advance a little bit into Germany simply to try to get the Germans thinking that a real attack on the Siegfried Line, which was several miles within the German border, was imminent. The first French attacks were a bluff to try to pull a few German divisions away from Poland immediately. But as we know, the Germans did not fall for this. And then, once a little bit in Germany, the main French offensives could then be launched a month later, and that would presumably pull away even more divisions. But of course, as we now know, a month later, Poland is off the map. So Poland fell before any offensive could be organized or assembled. And with Poland knocked out, well, now the French don't have any real reason to try to launch an offensive into Germany. And in fact, that's not the kind of war France wants to fight. And the only reason they were going to do it anyway would be to try to save Poland. With Poland out, there's no reason to do this, and so they withdraw. So here's the French army deployment at the time Germany invaded Holland and Belgium. Looking at this, does it look like the French had kept the Ardennes sector undefended? No, they assigned 2 whole armies to it, the 9th and the 2nd. The armies earmarked to move up to the KW line were the 1st and the 7th French armies, the British Expeditionary Force, and they would link up with the Belgian army. And hopefully they could link up with the Dutch army. But as we know, the Dutch chose to fight in Holland, and as a result were completely destroyed for almost no gain. So facing the Ardennes were the 2nd and 9th armies. Also keep in mind that the French strategic reserve was closest to the Ardennes front. So the thinking was that the Ardennes front, or the Meuse front, could afford to have less troops since the reserve was closest to them. The French also had 4 armies behind the Maginot Line, and you could say that's way too many, but keep in mind that these armies were mostly made up of B-grade divisions, low-quality conscripts, and old reservists. But besides, these men around the Maginot Line could always be pulled up into Belgium if the main reserve around Paris was depleted, and also they were close to the Ardennes if the Ardennes front needed some reinforcement there. So should an attack be made through the Ardennes, that would be the front easiest to flex to. either by putting units in from the strategic reserve, pulling units up from the Maginot Line, or, if absolutely need be, shifting units down from the KW line even. As a result, the 2nd and 9th Armies were not only about half the manpower of the forces that would be at the KW line, but they didn't have any armor divisions, though they had a small amount of organic armor in their cavalry divisions. The 3 French armor divisions, and yes, the French had some armor divisions, were kept in strategic reserve in the case of a German breakthrough somewhere. The French actually had more tanks than the Germans, but they were heavier and clearly meant for methodical battle, not deep strikes. And while most are sped throughout the infantry, the French concentrated enough tanks to have 3 armor divisions in reserve. The French knew there would be an attack through the Ardennes. The Belgians knew this, the Swiss knew this, even the Vatican knew this. The fact that the Germans were going to attack through the Ardennes was no secret to anyone. What surprised the French was the fact that this was actually the main advance. As we know, 7 of Germany's 10 armor divisions were dedicated to the Ardennes, while only 3 were used in the north. When the Germans attacked through the Ardennes, the 7 Belgian cavalry regiments down there only fought delaying actions before they retreated back to the KW line. The French sent a small force into the Ardennes with the intention to bolster the Belgians in there, so when the Belgians bailed before the French even showed up, the French found themselves with far fewer forces than they expected to have in the Ardennes. And this miscommunication regarding the allocation of forces in the Ardennes was a direct consequence of Leopold III breaking his alliance with France in 1936 as a result of France not invading the Rhine. And as a result, the French couldn't move in and just coordinate with the Belgians before the Germans invaded and figured everything out in a more organized fashion, as opposed to trying to hectically scramble together a war plan while Belgium was being invaded. As a result of the Belgian withdrawal, the Ardennes only had about half as many forces inside it as the French had originally anticipated there being. These very light forces were of course very quickly destroyed and pushed through and ultimately out of the Ardennes. But this creates an information problem for Gamelin. In terms of area on the map, the Germans had swept into Holland and they were destroying what culminated in a 280,000 man army in Holland. They were also pushing directly into Belgium, and in fact they had specially trained glider troops and engineers to knock out what was considered the most powerful single fortification in the world at the time at Ebony Mail. On top of that, virtually all of the German air power was concentrated along the Albert Canal line and in Holland in the opening days of the invasion. And so, after the first day of the fighting, Germany invaded on May 10th, so this is at the beginning of May 11th, Gamelin concluded that the main attack from the Germans was coming from the north, which made sense as most of the fighting was going on in the north under von Bock, and most of the area of advance was coming from the north. And Gamelin concluded that the Ardennes offensive was a secondary attack, possibly intended as a diversion. However, even though Gamelin thought the Ardennes attack was a secondary attack and possibly meant as a diversion, he still sent some reserve divisions up to the Meuse, which faced the Ardennes, just to be safe. By May 12th, the Germans had pushed all the way through the Ardennes and had reached the Meuse, and they were coming up against the Meuse line and the main French defensive forces facing the Ardennes. At this point, French reinforcements, including 2 of the 3 French armor divisions, were sent to the Meuse front, as the Meuse line, anchored by the fortified city of Sedan, was the last major barrier before the relatively open country of northern France. The Germans had pushed through the Ardennes by May 12, to the surprise of the French. But even then, the French believed it would still take another day before the Germans could attack Sedan, as that would be how long it would take for them to pull up their artillery. And the French were correct. That was about how long it would have taken for the Germans to pull up their artillery. But instead, the Germans attacked without artillery and immediately. And instead, the German Air Force launched the most concentrated air attack on a single target in the whole of World War II. So on May 12th began the Battle of Sedan. Sedan was defended by a mixture of regular and fortress infantry, or B divisions. There were 6 main bridgeheads going into Sedan, and the Germans were stopped cold at 4 of them. The crossings were made by infantry, not tanks obviously, of the 1st Panzer Division and Grossdeutschland, which were considered the 2 best divisions in the German army. The 2nd and 10th Panzer Divisions failed at their crossings. The airstrikes, and remember this is the most powerful concentrated air bombardment in all of World War II, the airstrikes were effective not at destroying the bunkers at Sedan, but forced the interval troops between the bunkers to fall back, which made the bunkers vulnerable for engineers to swarm and blow the casemates. But even so, the French still held at 4 of the 6 crossings. So let's recap this. Sedan is facing the most concentrated aerial bombardment in World War II. Despite this, a bunch of no-name B-grade infantry and regulars, the equivalent of about 5 divisions, managed to hold off 10th Panzer, 2nd Panzer, and almost hold off 1st Panzer and Grossdeutschland. These are the absolute best of the best German divisions, the absolute tip of the spear. But they eventually lost, so I guess this means that forts don't work or something. And so I'm looking at this situation, and it's like the French at Sedan just didn't know that they were supposed to fold in all of 5 minutes against these kinds of units in this kind of attack. But in their ignorance, they almost mounted a successful defense. The fighting at Sedan went on for 3 more days, even after the Germans made the bridgeheads. And even after the French were pushed out of Sedan, they still fought at the nearby town of Ston for 2 more days. Ston was on the heights overlooking Sedan, and Sedan was important because of supply throughput. The Germans needed to take Sedan in order to supply an offensive that could go all the way to the Channel. The Germans had made other crossings at the Meuse, but those crossings didn't have the supply throughput to sustain an offensive that they wanted to make. Holding Ston allowed the French to shell Sedan, even if they couldn't completely stop supply throughput through Sedan. So the Germans had to take Ston. And after 2 days of fighting, in which Ston went back and forth 17 times, on May 17th, the Germans finally took Ston, and we could say fully secured Sedan. By this time that Sedan fully fell, the front line had moved 40 miles past Sedan itself. Bock's army, at this point, was forced to make attacks that were doomed to fail simply to keep up the appearance that his army was the main army up in the north. And in these attacks, the Germans were fighting against prepared French defenses or in pitched battles, particularly at Hainaut and Gembloux, and in these situations, the French came off better. These weren't even attacks on the KW line. These were excursions out from it, and so most likely the KW line would have held against the main German attack had the Germans gone that way. By the 15th of May, Gamelin realized that the main German attack was through the Ardennes. The Germans had successfully fooled the French for 5 days, and they had lured the very best French and British forces up to the KW line. Another problem was that the 1st and 3rd French armor divisions, which weren't sent to the KW line but were back in strategic reserves, they had been wiped out trying to counterattack towards Sedan. The 2nd Division was wiped out while it was trying to form up, and the 4th Division under de Gaulle was simply wiped out in counterattacks against Rommel and Guderian's forces that were pushing far past the Meuse. There were 3 French armor divisions at the beginning of the battle, and the French managed to form a 4th just in time for it to be wiped out in counterattacks towards Sedan. The French armor divisions have been destroyed in detail, one by one, because they counterattacked one by one instead of all at once. And the reason the French armor divisions attacked one by one is because the French didn't know that this was the main German axis of advance until after these counterattacks had failed. Consider on May 12th, just 2 days after the invasion began, Gamelin still thinks that von Bock's army is the main army. and that Rommel and Guderian going through the Ardennes, that they're just diversions. So he doesn't want to fall for that diversion through the Ardennes by committing all 3 and then later 4 of the French armored divisions towards the Meuse line, when they might be needed up at the KW line, which Gamelin thought was going to be the culmination point. And this is also why the French and British couldn't counterattack very easily on May 17th, because much of their punching power was destroyed before the Germans got anywhere near Dunkirk. By around May 17th, the Allied 1st Army Group, which again contained the Belgian Army, the British Expeditionary Force, and the French 1st and 7th, began to abandon the KW line and started falling back towards France and the interior of Belgium. But the problem is they were doing so while being harassed from the rear by von Barth and Kleist's army groups. Now at this point, we know that the 1st Army Group failed to evade encirclement, and once they were encircled, they tried to break the ring, and once that failed, they began Operation Dynamo to get out of there, which culminated in the epic evacuation at Dunkirk. I'm not going to do any play-by-play beyond this point, as we all know roughly what happens after Sedan. But the point I want to make here is that there really wasn't much the French could do after around May 17th. The breakthrough at Sedan forced the French into mobile warfare, which the French were not particularly predisposed to anyway. But on top of that, their main striking force in those 4 armored divisions had been destroyed in efforts to retake Sedan. And seeing just exactly how the Germans managed to get through the Ardennes, how the French did not leave it as an open door, that the French were reinforcing it as fast as they could. They simply couldn't reinforce it fast enough. It wasn't obviously the main axis of advance. Any reasonable general would consider that the main strike was going through Belgium and Holland, that the Germans had managed to take Sedan in 2 days. Do you see the reasoning behind what the French did and how this was kind of an impossible situation for the French? Do you see how every move that the French made total sense, and why nobody should tolerate nonsense like mocking the Maginot Line as something the Germans just went around it, or the myth that the French left the Ardennes open, or the myth that the French were rapaciously milking Germany for war reparations far beyond what they were truly owed, or the myth that the French surrendered quickly. The French had 104 divisions committed to the war against Germany before the Great Encirclement up in Flanders and Operation Dynamo. This does not count the British Expeditionary Force or the Belgian Army, which I believe counted for another 30 divisions. After the disaster in the north and the substantial losses in the south as a result of Rommel and Guderian's advances past the Meuse, the French had 43 divisions, and around 80% of their armored and motorized forces were lost in the Meuse counterattacks and up in Belgium and Flanders to the encirclements of the 1st Army Group. But here's what's interesting. After the disasters at Sedan and the encirclement of 1st Army Group, the French losing most of their armored divisions and motorized divisions, and with the remaining units being even more disproportionately B divisions, B-grade units, and being deep into open country, away from all the fortifications and away from the defensive terrain and rivers in and around Belgium, and away from any of the well-planned out defensive lines that they had established in what should have been a complete rout. This is when the German advance actually started to slow. The French, in a matter of 14 days, invented and implemented a new doctrine to deal with the German tactics that they called hedgehog defense, where a unit would not be based necessarily on a continuous front, but would be balls of self-contained units with enough supplies to be encircled and hold out in a town or a particularly defensive territory, and their defense would be set up in 360 degrees. Colonel General List of the German 12th Army commented, quote, "The French are putting up strong opposition. No signs of demoralization are evident anywhere. We are seeing a new French way of fighting." The letter of a French tank officer to his wife said much of the same. Quote, "We've taken a heck of a pasting, and there's hardly anyone left, but those still here have fantastic morale. We no longer think about the awful nightmare we've been through. That's typical of the French soldier. If you could only know the happiness of going into a scrap with chaps like these." The French adapted, and they adapted extremely fast. And this brief period gives a window into what could have been, into what the French army of 1940 was really made of and could be seen if it was given a little bit of a chance. Previous flashes of it were seen at Hainaut and Gembloux, and even the effectiveness of their defense at Sedan. A similar phenomenon to what happened to the French toward the end occurred near the end of Nazi Germany, as Germany lost Romania, lost Hungary, lost Italy, lost whatever minor allies they had. Suddenly the fronts narrowed and the objectives simplified. No longer would one have to fight to hold Budapest or launch relief offensives in hopes of keeping a few Hungarian divisions in the war. No need to fight on the Romanian border to protect the oil, as Romania was gone. No need to even trouble your mind with oil itself, as that was all gone too. No need to worry about trying to maintain that expensive air force, as that was all but wiped out. No need to hold Italy to keep the puppet regime RSA in northern Italy alive. That was gone too. No need to garrison Serbia or deal with partisans in the Balkans. No need to garrison France, the Low Countries, Poland, as they were all lost. No need to fight in the open fields of France. All had narrowed. And what both the Soviet and US generals observed was that it was if the Germans took on a second wind in late 44 and the first 3 months of 1945. In 1940, the French had no need to advance into any positions in Belgium or Holland, as they had capitulated. No need to babysit the BEF, as the British had fled. No need to try to relieve the Dunkirk pocket, as it had either been liquidated or destroyed. They had one task, and they were one with nothing. Let me put it like this. It took the French slightly less than 2 years to adopt the policy of methodical battle that changed their fortunes during the Great War of 1914. It took the French about 14 days to adopt completely new defensive tactics in the 1940 Franco-German War. With the failure of the deal plan, the old doctrine was discredited, the old guard fell silent, and in the 12th hour reformed the French army in a moment to something more effective. In this brief moment, this flash from June 4 to June 22nd, France was finally given the gift of defeat and had a terminal lucidity that inflicted more casualties on the Germans with these remaining forces than they managed to do prior to June 4th. Those cheese-eating surrender monkeys, losing more than half of their army by mass, perhaps 2/3 of their army by combat effectiveness, fight completely out of their defenses and out of their plan that they've spent decades preparing. And here's where the line was when they surrendered on June 25th. Though I suspect this is more of an approximation, as I don't believe a front line really existed at this point. By contrast, here's the quote-unquote front line, to the extent there was one, for when Germany surrendered in 1945. Just eyeballing it, I would say it's pretty close in terms of percentage of territorial value as what France had when they surrendered. Maybe Germany held out a week longer in terms of fighting past collapse than the French did, but this is pretty close. The French wouldn't have had more than, say, 10 days at the most, at the very most, for the rest of their country to be occupied. There were even some advanced German units that had gotten to the border with Spain, but oh, the French should have had those men killed too. Maybe if they sacrificed the remaining 100,000 men in their armed forces, they could have taken 5,000 Germans with them and made England and America's job just a little bit easier as a result. I have an idea. France lost enough blood in the Great War, and perhaps it's time for England to do the bleeding. Or better yet, maybe the answer was to align with the Germans. After all, what had France's alliance with England against Germany gotten her? Well, it had gotten her blood to England's credit. And would subsuming to a German order really be the worst thing? What's the alternative? Subsuming to an Anglo-American order? At least Germany fought her own wars, unlike perfidious Albion, who pushed France into this war and then sent a token army that ran away when things got tough and didn't even implement full conscription the way France did. You can at least see the point here. As we know, these thoughts never manifested past the opportunistic collaboration of the Vichy regime. And of course, the French could not have known how barbarous the Hitler regime truly was at this point. On June 23, 1940, Hitler visited Paris, and he went to Napoleon's tomb. The reports were that he just stood at it for about 10 minutes. And then he turned around and ordered a guard to be assigned to the tomb, and that boards be placed on the floor to prevent scuff marks from German boots. He is later reported to have said of his visit, "This was the greatest and finest moment of my life." A remark of penetrating ambiguity. One problem in making this video is that there's not as much footage available of French units as you might think. The reason I think this is that for the Germans, it's easier for the film crew to just follow the spearhead, and since almost by definition the spearhead succeeds, or at least isn't going to be overrun anytime soon until the spearhead is blocked and fails, the camera crew can be just dropped in there and will get good footage, and can get good footage fairly close to the fighting. French camera crews, on the other hand, have to predict where the attack is going to be, and they would have to film a collapsing front line, get away from the battle, film more of the collapse, and repeat this process all the way to Dunkirk or to Paris. So it would be much harder for the French to actually get any war footage than it was for the German crews. The result is that most of the war footage we get of French soldiers is of them surrendering or being shelled at range. And this lack of footage of French units in combat may be at least part of the reason for the misconception as to how French units actually fought in World War II. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please consider donating to Patreon, which is done on a per video basis. I don't spam videos. Each one has a lot of work put into it, and my goal is for the person watching this to go, yeah, that was worth $5. And these videos on average take about 20 hours to make. This one took a bit longer, so just to consider. Also, for the notifications for videos, consider using an RSS reader for the YouTube channel, and I'll have a link in the description that explains how to set up an RSS reader for your YouTube channels so you can just get the videos popping up in your RSS feed when the videos are posted by the channel. You're not having to deal with any Google algorithms. Or you can use a third-party application such as YouTube Notifications that just gives you a dumb feed.